Hello there. It's me again, Clyde. Before we get too cozy here in this little Appalachian cabin, go ahead and tap that like button and subscribe now so you don't forget. Once you start to drift off, I know how it goes. You mean to do it later, but by then, you're half asleep and your phone's fallen somewhere under your pillow. If you enjoy these boring adventures, you can also become a channel member. It helps keep the firewood stocked, and you'll even get your very own personalized sleepy story from me. You'll find my whole playlist of time-traveling naps and drowsy detours right on the channel. Now then, the air tonight smells of baked apples and butter. The cabin walls hum faintly with the warmth of the wood stove, and somewhere outside, a whip-poor-will keeps the rhythm of the evening. The pie is on the sill, cooling beneath a square of soft light, its crust rising and falling with little sighs. A squirrel, gray and curious, clings to the windowsill, nose twitching, eyes bright. He doesn't move, though. Neither do I. It's 1933, or maybe 1934. It's hard to tell from where I stand in time. But the air has the weary sweetness of the Great Depression years. Folks here still manage to find joy where they can. Pie helps with that. There's a clock on the mantel that ticks too loud for its size. It's one of those square, wind-up kinds with the second hand that lurches forward instead of gliding. I've been watching it for, well, quite some time. You can lose track when all you're doing is waiting for a pie to cool. Someone has crocheted a blanket over the back of the chair beside me, pale green, fraying at the corners, like it's been around since the Hoover administration. On the shelf above the stove, there's a jar of buttons, 3 old marbles, and a photograph of a young couple in stiff Sunday clothes. The man's eyes look proud, but tired, like he's thinking about a field that needs plowing or a barn roof that still leaks. Funny thing, there's also a potato shaped almost exactly like the state of Kentucky sitting beside the pie. Maybe someone saved it for luck. Through the open window, the mountain air slides in, bringing the scent of pine and the faint, faraway laughter of someone playing a fiddle down the road. It might be Saturday. People here make their own fun because the radio doesn't always come in clear through the hills. Sometimes, when the wind blows just right, you can hear the train whistle echo between the ridges, a long, lonely sound that always seems to fade before you can be sure you heard it. I imagine that train carrying folks off to Cincinnati or Nashville, somewhere where pie cools on cafe counters instead of cabin sills. The squirrel finally blinks, twitches his tail, and scurries away into the twilight. I stay put. There's no reason to rush. Not tonight. The crust on the pie makes a little cracking sound as it settles, and that sound alone could fill an evening. I suppose I could have sat down while I waited, but the only chair in this cabin has one leg shorter than the others. Every time you try to sit in it, you end up feeling like you're sliding slightly downhill, which isn't ideal for a long wait. Still, I gave it a go. The chair let out a sigh so deep I half expected it to apologize afterward. It's an old thing, handmade no doubt. One of those chairs that's been patched, glued, and nailed more times than anyone could count. There's a small cushion tied to it with faded blue ribbon, probably stuffed with straw or fabric scraps. I lean back carefully, and the sound it makes is almost like a fiddle string being tightened. Across the room, there's a shelf of curiosities, a tiny glass bottle labeled Coal Dust, 1931. A dried flower pressed between 2 panes of cracked glass. A pencil stub with teeth marks halfway down its length. It's funny how objects can tell stories even when no one's around to explain them. Maybe that bottle belonged to someone who worked in the mines, a keepsake of hard days underground. The flower could have been a gift, or maybe it grew wild by the tracks. Outside, a pair of crows are arguing over something shiny in the grass. I can't see what it is, but one keeps strutting around with that self-important air that crows have when they think they've found treasure. The other just stands there, waiting, patient and suspicious, like he knows it's only a bottle cap. Somewhere in the woods, A screen door bangs. Not from this cabin, this one barely has a latch, but from somewhere down the slope. The sound bounces up through the trees, carried on the cool wind that smells faintly of damp moss and wood smoke. The pie's scent drifts closer again. I can almost hear the sugar hardening on the crust. There's something comforting about that, the idea that time moves whether or not we notice. My eyes drift to a calendar on the wall. August 1933. The picture shows a smiling woman in a polka dot dress advertising washing powder. The edges are curled, and a few dates have small notes scribbled in pencil. Quilt meeting, fix the roof, and radio night. Radio night. That's the one that catches my attention. It must be when the folks in these hills gather around one of the few sets that can pick up a distant signal, maybe from Nashville or Pittsburgh, and listen to the crackling voices talk about Roosevelt's fireside chats or about the Dust Bowl sweeping the Midwest. I imagine a small group sitting together, their faces lit by that warm amber glow, nodding silently as if the voice on the radio can somehow see them. The squirrel returns. I swear it's the same one. This time he's brought an acorn and looks mildly offended that the pie hasn't cooled enough for sharing. He taps the windowsill once with his paw and then freezes, staring right at me, like he's judging my patience. I tell him softly, "It takes time, friend. You can't rush a pie." He blinks, and somehow, I think he understands. The chair creaks again and I shift my weight. The pocket watch on my chest ticks faintly. I haven't looked at it yet. Not tonight. For now, I'll just sit here, crooked and all, and wait. The lamplight flickers once, and I wonder if the wick's too low. The pie's still cooling, its edges catching the glow of the flame like a horizon line at sunset. The squirrel has vanished again, probably gone off to tell the others about the strange man who just sits and waits. On the far side of the cabin sits a boxy old radio. One of those big wooden ones with round dials and cloth stretched across the speaker like it's trying to hide its secrets. I walk over to it, slowly, so the floorboards don't complain too loudly. The cabin settles around me, sighing in the way old wood does after decades of listening to quiet. The radio hums faintly when I turn the knob. Static, at first, a wild rush of wind and distant sparks. Then, a voice tries to push through. It's shaky, thin, slipping in and out like a memory. And prices of wheat have fallen again, it says before fading into a soft hiss. For a moment, I think I hear music. Maybe a fiddle, or maybe the sound of a table leg squeaking under the weight of time. I twist the dial gently, hoping for more, but the static returns. Bigger this time, like a thunderstorm made of bees. There's something romantic about the idea of a world connected by invisible threads of sound, all these people sitting in their own quiet rooms, waiting for the same faraway voice to reach them. In 1933, news traveled slowly, and sometimes it didn't travel at all. If your radio didn't work, you just had to trust the neighbor down the road to tell you what Roosevelt said. A small piece of paper is tucked behind the radio, yellowed at the corners. I pull it out carefully. It's a grocery list, written in pencil, smudged by years of dust. Flour, molasses, salt pork, kerosene, thread. There's something so human about that list. Like a ghost of ordinary living, still hanging around. I try the radio again. This time, a faint melody slips through. A church hymn, I think, but played by someone who isn't quite sure of all the notes. There's comfort in that, too. People trying their best, even when things don't sound perfect. The squirrel returns for the third time. This time, he's bolder. He hops onto the sill and stares through the window as if he owns the place. His little nose twitches at the smell of the pie. I tell him he'll have to wait, too. When I look back, the radio's quiet again. But the hum of life outside, the crickets, the far-off creek, the shifting trees, fills the silence just fine. A shadow passes by the window, probably just a moth or maybe a neighbor heading home from somewhere. You can tell a lot about a time period by how many people carry lanterns at night. I sit back in the crooked chair again. The radio keeps its secrets, and the pie keeps cooling. Time moves the way molasses does on a cold morning. Slow, sticky, and patient. And maybe that's how it's meant to be. I was starting to think the night had settled in for good when I heard boots on the porch. Not heavy, just careful. Like someone testing each board to see which one still held steady after all these years. A moment later, the door creaked open, slowly, respectfully, and a man stepped into the glow of the lamp. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with a face that looked like it had spent more time in the wind than out of it. His hat had seen better days, but so had most things in 1933. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said, tipping his hat. "Saw the light. Wasn't sure if anyone was still living up here." I told him I wasn't really from around here, which was true, though not in the way he'd ever guess. He nodded like that made sense anyway. "Name's Amos. My brother used to come up here to hunt. Haven't been back since the big flood washed the bridge out in 1929. He set his lantern on the table beside the radio, and for a moment, the room was brighter than it had been all night. The light danced on the glass jars, making them sparkle like something precious. Amos looked around, his eyes softening when they landed on the pie. "Smells like heaven itself stopped by," he said, chuckling. I told him it wasn't mine to eat, still cooling. That seemed to amuse him even more. "Pie's like trouble," he said. "Looks harmless till you rush it." He had that kind of voice that carried stories even when he wasn't telling one. I could tell he'd been through more winters than most, and maybe a few that never quite ended. He sat down on the stool near the stove, stretching his hands toward the faint warmth. "You ever been through these parts before?" he asked. I said I'd passed through. Again, not exactly a lie. "Then you know folks around here hold on to what little joy they can," he said. "Back when the mines closed, everyone thought the mountains would go silent, but we just got quieter instead." He reached into his coat and pulled out a harmonica, its metal edges worn smooth. "Still works, though," he said, and he played a few notes, soft, wandering ones that barely rose above the crackle of the lamp flame. It wasn't a tune I knew. It sounded like something between a hymn and a lullaby, with a little loneliness tucked between the breaths. The squirrel, curious as ever, hopped back up onto the sill as if he'd come to listen too. The pie sat perfectly still, soaking up the music. When Amos finished, he set the harmonica down and said quietly, "Sometimes, it ain't about fixing what's broken. It's about playing through it." He stood then, gave a polite nod, and took up his lantern again. "You take care of that pie, friend," he said before stepping out into the night. The door clicked softly behind him. Outside, the sound of his boots faded into the rhythm of the crickets. The cabin seemed a little emptier after he left, but not lonely, more like it had been reminded what companionship felt like. I looked at the pie again. The steam had slowed. Maybe it was finally ready. But I wasn't. Not yet. After Amos left, the silence settled over the cabin like a blanket, thick, soft, and comforting in its own way. The pie sat on the sill, perfectly still now, the crust golden and proud as if it knew it had survived a long day's work. The squirrel, finally satisfied, disappeared into the dark, probably off to brag about his evening entertainment to the other woodland audience members. The only sound left was the gentle ticking of the mantel clock, echoing faintly in the corners of the room. I watched its hands crawl forward, and I thought about how clocks in places like this never seem to run exactly right. They drift a little, the way people do when no one's looking. On the back of the nearby chair, that pale green quilt caught my eye again. I'd noticed it earlier, but now the lamplight revealed its story. The squares were all different. Some floral, some striped. One with a faded scrap of what looked like an old feed sack that once read Dixie Milling Company. Every patch had been stitched by hand, the seams slightly uneven, but it was beautiful for it. I lifted it gently, and dust motes danced in the air like they'd been waiting for someone to wake them. The fabric smelled faintly of cedar, and sunshine long gone. I draped it across my lap and thought about all the hands that must have touched it over the years, mothers, grandmothers, children who'd fallen asleep beneath it while a storm rolled through the holler. Funny how quilts are like time machines of their own. Each patch is a year, a moment, a scrap of someone's story, sewn into something meant to keep others warm. The wind outside picked up just enough to rattle the loose pane in the window. I reached over and pressed my palm against the cool glass. The forest out there was darker now, just outlines and shadows, the smell of damp pine and earth rolling in. Somewhere far off, a whip-poor-will called out again, steady, patient, like a metronome keeping rhythm for the night. Inside, the lamplight flickered lower. I found myself wondering who usually sat here, waiting for a pie to cool. Maybe a young couple, maybe a grandmother with her grandchildren, maybe no one at all anymore. Sometimes I think places like this remember us long after we're gone. They hold on to the laughter, the footsteps, the sound of spoons scraping bowls, even if the world outside keeps changing. I brushed a bit of flour from the table and noticed a small wooden button resting in the dust. It was simple, hand-carved, maybe whittled from hickory. Someone had lost it long ago, probably off a child's coat. I picked it up and set it beside the pie, like returning a piece of history to where it belonged. The pie gave off one last faint sigh as it cooled completely. The air around it smelled like cinnamon, apples, and home. And for a while, I just sat there, under that old quilt, feeling the years stretch and fold around me like fabric. It was late enough that the crickets had gone from chatter to lullaby. The air had that thick stillness that settles right before true night takes over. I folded the quilt neatly over the arm of the chair. It deserved better than to be slept under by a stranger. On the table, beside the oil lamp, sat a pie knife with a wooden handle worn smooth from decades of use. Someone had carved initials into it, just 2 letters, E and J. Maybe the maker, maybe the person who'd used it most. I held it for a moment, feeling the faint groove of the letters, wondering if they stood for a husband and wife or just a name that no one said anymore. The lamplight flickered as if agreeing that it didn't matter either way. Both sounded like love. When I set the knife down, it made a small, deliberate sound, the kind that announces it belongs right where it's resting. I've noticed that about old things. Tools, chairs, even spoons. They seem to remember their place in the world. Maybe that's why I like visiting times like this. Things still have the patience to stay put. I leaned back, listening again to the faint ticking of the mantel clock. That's when I remembered my own pocket watch. It hung from its leather strap against my chest, still and cool. I hadn't checked it all evening, mostly because I didn't want to be reminded of how far from any real time I might be. But curiosity always wins, doesn't it? I lifted it, thumb tracing the smooth brass surface. The light from the lamp caught on the glass face, and for a second I could see my reflection, a tired traveler in another man's century. The hands pointed to 10:43, though whether that meant morning or night in my home era was anyone's guess. A moth fluttered near the flame and then veered away, wise enough to keep its wings. I thought about the strange dance between light and time, how people used to measure their days by the height of the sun, and now, in this moment, I was measuring mine by how long it takes an apple pie to cool. There was a strange comfort in that. The knife caught a faint reflection of the lamplight again, and for a brief second, I could almost see a hand that wasn't mine holding it. A woman's hand, maybe, setting the table, calling her children to supper in a voice that carried through the woods. Then the vision faded, just a trick of light and longing. I closed the pocket watch softly and set it beside the knife. The two gleamed like they'd been old friends all along. Outside, the wind eased. The smell of the forest crept back in through the open window, carrying with it a hint of damp bark and wild mint. Somewhere down the slope, a dog barked once, then stopped, as if remembering it was too tired to keep at it. The night felt gentle now, full of space for remembering. And I suppose if there's a better definition of peace than that, I haven't found it yet. Just as I was about to cut into the pie, there came a knock at the door. Not loud, more like the kind of knock that asks permission to exist. I froze for a second, the knife still in hand. The squirrel outside flicked his tail and bolted, leaving me alone with the echo. Another soft knock followed. When I opened the door, a young woman stood on the porch, her hair pinned up loosely, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. The lantern she carried gave off a nervous little light. She looked like she might have walked miles in the dark, but she smiled politely, like she'd done this 100 times. "Evening," she said. Didn't mean to intrude. Amos said there was still a light here. So Amos hadn't gone far. She held up a small tin pail. He sent me up with some cream, said you might need it for the pie. I laughed quietly. He was right about that. She stepped inside just far enough to escape the wind. The lamplight caught her face, a kindness in her eyes that made the old cabin seem less lonely. She looked around as though she were visiting a memory. "My grandmother used to bake here," she said. "This was her place. Haven't been inside since before the flood. I almost didn't recognize it without her radio playing." I gestured toward the table where the same radio sat, still faintly humming as if it remembered her too. "It still works," I said. "Sometimes." That made her smile. She placed the pail beside the pie, then brushed a hand across the back of a chair like she was greeting an old friend. "She used to cool pies on that same sill," she said softly. "Apple, mostly. Sometimes blackberry when the hills were good to us." Her eyes drifted toward the folded quilt on the chair. "She made that," she added. "Took her a whole winter. Said it was a story in stitches." I nodded. "It feels like one." We stood in the quiet for a while, just listening to the world breathe. The smell of apple and cinnamon filled the small room like a hymn. Then she said, almost to herself, "It's funny. I thought when she passed, the house would stop feeling alive, but it's like it's been waiting. Maybe just for someone to sit still and listen again." There wasn't much to say after that. I handed her a slice of pie and poured a little of the cream over the top. She took a seat and ate slowly, like she was tasting more than just sugar and spice. When she finished, she thanked me and left the plate where it was. "You take care of this place," she said. She'd like knowing someone's keeping the stories company. Then she stepped back into the night, her lantern bobbing through the trees until it was just a spark. The pie sat quietly again, and the cabin hummed as if it too were remembering. After she left, I stood in the doorway a long while, watching her lantern disappear between the trees. The night air carried the faint scent of rain on the way, though the stars still tried their best to hold the sky together. The cabin gave a small creak, like it was settling into the quiet again. I closed the door softly, turned the latch, and leaned my shoulder against the frame for a moment. A gentle wind slipped through a gap near the rafters, carrying with it a few notes of the night, the rustle of leaves, the faint hum of cicadas, and something else I couldn't quite place. It sounded like humming, not from outside, but from within the walls themselves. I smiled. Places like this collect echoes. I took a slow walk around the small room. The shadows shifted along the logs, the lamplight flickering like it was trying to whisper something too faint to hear. I reached up and touched one of the old beams, rough under my fingers, carved in places with initials and little notches. Someone had marked the years right into the wood: 1925, 1927, 1930. The handwriting changed with each, but the knife marks stayed steady. There's something deeply human about leaving proof of yourself behind where no one might ever find it. Maybe it's hope, or maybe it's just habit. The wind grew stronger for a moment, and the pie tin rattled faintly against the sill. I crossed the room and steadied it, then looked out the window again. The forest was alive with shadows that only half meant to scare you, branches moving like arms, fireflies drifting close enough to look like tiny lanterns of their own. I thought again of the woman, her quiet way of speaking, how she'd said her grandmother baked here. Maybe that meant this wasn't just a cabin. It was a memory that refused to fade. I pulled the chair closer to the window and sat down again. The pie knife still rested where I'd left it, beside the folded quilt. My pocket watch caught the lamplight just enough to glow faintly in the dark. For a while, I just listened. The wind through the rafters, the slow ticking of the clock, and the faint scratching of something in the corner. Maybe a mouse, maybe just time moving. If you sit quietly long enough in a place like this, the silence starts to sound like company. And so I did. By now, the cabin had settled into that deep kind of silence that only exists in old wooden places, where every sound becomes important. The ticking of the clock felt slower, heavier. The flame in the lamp leaned slightly toward the draft, sneaking through the cracks. The pie was cool. I could tell by the way the air above it no longer shimmered. I took the knife again and pressed it gently through the crust. The sound it made, soft, crisp, a little sighing, was worth the wait. Steam rose one last time, faint and sweet, like a secret escaping. The first slice came out clean, and that felt like a small miracle. The filling gleamed golden brown and familiar, though I hadn't had apple pie since another century entirely. I sat there with the piece on my plate for a long time before taking a bite. It tasted like every version of home a person could hope for. Cinnamon, sugar, and the warmth of something that survived too many seasons to be anything but humble. Funny thing about time travel. Food is always the same, no matter the year. People are, too, in their own ways. We bake, we wait, we share, and sometimes we sit alone with the smell of something we can't quite name. As I ate, I caught a glimpse of movement out the window. Fireflies again, dozens of them now, lighting up the tree line like they were celebrating something. Maybe they were. Maybe the forest always knows when a pie is ready. I thought about Amos and the young woman, how they'd both found their way to this little cabin, drawn by something quiet and old. I wondered if their lives ever overlapped, or if I was the only one who'd met both. That's the thing about these moments. They feel small while you're in them, but later, you realize they were the entire story. I leaned back in the chair, feeling the wood creak beneath me, the weight of the quilt still resting over my shoulders. The pocket watch on the table reflected a small line of light, like the moon trying to speak in brass. I didn't open it this time. I didn't need to. Instead, I just breathed and let the night exist exactly as it was, unhurried, full, perfectly incomplete. The pie knife rested in the empty plate. The lamp flickered low, and outside, the wind carried the scent of apples through the trees, like it was trying to remember where it came from. By the time I finished the last bite of pie, the lamp had burned low, and the edges of the world had gone soft. The kind of stillness that follows good company, even when the company is memory, filled the little cabin. Outside, the forest breathed like something alive. I could hear the hush of the trees, the softest sigh of the creek down below. Every now and then, the faint clink of the wind chime on the porch joined in, a lopsided rhythm that somehow fit the night just right. I brushed the crumbs from the table, folded the napkin that wasn't mine, and looked around the cabin one last time. It felt like I was the last note of a long, slow song that didn't want to end. The pocket watch sat beside the empty plate, patient as ever. I reached for it and held it in my palm, its cool metal grounding me to the now. And that's when I felt it. That soft, almost imperceptible vibration. The stone in my pocket, smooth and round, with that faint inner hum, was waking up again. It never made a sound, never glowed until the very last moment, but I always knew when it was time. I took one last look at the pie tin, at the folded quilt, at the empty chair by the window where Amos had sat. Every corner of that cabin felt full of stories, of laughter that had once been, of quiet that had been earned. I stood, brushing a bit of flour dust from my sleeve, and stepped toward the door. The moon had risen high enough to silver the path, and the fireflies still flickered like distant thoughts that didn't want to fade. When I stepped outside, the stone pulsed faintly in my hand. It's a strange thing, leaving behind a time that never really belonged to you but somehow feels like home anyway. I turned the stone over once, twice, and the hum deepened, resonating in my chest. The air around me shimmered just slightly, the scent of apples and smoke twisting into something like wind and memory. And as the cabin grew faint, the lantern, the pie, the quilt, the quiet, I thought about what Amos had said. Sometimes it ain't about fixing what's broken, it's about playing through it. The world folded softly in on itself, and I felt the slow weight of time release, like an exhale after holding too long. Wherever I was headed next, it would be quiet, uneventful, probably boring, just the way I like it. And if you've made it this far, thank you for listening. You can find the rest of my sleepy travels in the Clyde playlist, full of stories just as ordinary and just as long. Don't forget to subscribe before you drift off, because I'd hate for you to miss another perfectly boring adventure. Until next time, good night.